Okay.
So today is June 2nd, 2022, and we're going to do another interview. So Grandpa, last time we spoke, we talked about Esther, and we learned about a bit of things about her, or at least I did. I learned a bit about Esther. Today I wanted to talk about your mother. We've talked way back in the beginning when we started the videos, we talked about kind of her childhood and what you knew about her childhood and growing up, and she married your father. And we've talked a little bit, we had a story about when you got enrolled in elementary school in LA when you were probably 6 or 7 years old. But we haven't really talked too much about her since then. So today I was hoping we could kind of focus on learning a bit more about your mother and basically her life story, because I know that's an important part of your life story. So does that sound reasonable?
Okay, I hear you.
Okay. So, and hopefully, and I don't know a lot about your mom. I have some very faded memories of her when I was a child because she was alive, but I don't really know actually a lot about her. So that's partly why I want to talk to you about her. So I guess picking up, starting from when you were a childhood and stuff, I guess, what did she do like during your childhood? And what was she like? Did she have interests, hobbies? Tell me about your mom, I guess.
Okay. My mother was a very benign woman. I never heard her complain. I never remember her having any disagreements with my father. I really don't have much to talk about her because for one thing, in asking both Shirley and myself at times when I've grown up, we always would ask the same question any child would ask your mother: what did you do? Where were you? Did you do this? Did you do that? At the time, for whatever reason, your mother was not really truthful about almost anything she said, because I believe that she did not want to be associated with the disease that killed her mother and father. And that was I can't think of the name of it now, tuberculosis. And at the time, tuberculosis was a no-no. It was a rampant disease that exploded in this country before the turn of the century, that is going from the 19th to the 20th century. And almost every community in the country at that time had what they called a sanitarium, which was a medical facility for tuberculosis patients. And as a result, we all knew that both my mother and father were born in New York City. But any questions we would ask about our grandparents, what did she do when she grew up and all that, was all a fib. I tried to make that as easy as possible. I'm not calling it a lie. I'm calling it a fib, because she just didn't want to be associated with that. So everything I know about my mother came from unrelated articles, that stories that I read or heard. My cousin Chuck Grossman was primarily responsible for a lot of the information that I got. And some of this I've reiterated before, but just to go over it again. According to my mother, she was born and raised in New York. She would talk about it, obviously all a fib. She never told us how she got to Denver. She never told us about how she met my father, and everything I found out about her either came from Chuck Grossman or a little research on my part, or unassociated stories that I could relate to. So basically, this is what happened. Both grandparents, that is the Richards and the Grossmans, immigrated to this country. The Richards came first. I'm not sure what year. It was either in the late 1880s. Hold on just a minute. I have a visitor.
You're going to tell us a little bit about the history of your grandparents, and we've talked a little bit about that. The Richards and the Grossmans moving to New York, and then subsequently moving to Denver, and then Irene essentially moving in.
Oh, okay, I remember.
After.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I remember. Okay. After the Richards came to this country, the Grossmans immigrated here in the late 1890s. I don't have an exact year. They both lived in the same neighborhood in New York. I don't know, have no information how either one of my grandparents contracted TB, as it was called then. It was actually had another name, and that was called consumption, because the disease literally consumed you, consumed your health, and killed you. People that survived it, if they survived the initial onslaught of TB, their life was probably cut short from what they would have had if they hadn't had TB. How did the Richards and the Grossmans get to Denver? Again, no dates on how or why they left New York, but the most probable reason was there was something in Denver called the Jewish Hospital. Continue.
Yeah,
Okay.
we keep getting interrupted. You're popular this morning. The number
Yeah.
of interruptions.
Okay, let's see. Okay, how did the Richards and Grossmans get to Denver? They're Denver, of course, is famous as the Mile High City, and people that were sick with numerous diseases, especially pulmonary diseases. Apparently, the climate in Denver was very helpful to them. So it's reasonable to assume that the Grossmans went to Denver for their health. And the Richards, for whatever reason, followed them there. Now, my mother was born in New York City in 1901. I know she went to grammar school in 1907, 1906 or 1907, which would put her 5, 6, or 7 years old. I can't think of the numbers. So sometime between the time she was born in 1907, they went to Denver. Now, she was not very truthful with us in asking questions. Like at the time, the question, this was just a few years after World War I ended in 1918. My mother and father were married in 1919. Shirley was born in 1921, and I was born in 1923. So the time fits pretty good. What did Daddy do in World War I? According to my mother, he was on a ship in New York City. It was just getting ready to leave to go to France. Not true. Where did you go to school? In New York. All her friends were in New York. She cited friends and had a reality to her stories that we believed until evidence to the contrary began appearing. The truth of the matter is the Richards followed the Grossmans to Denver sometime between the 1902 and 1907. I know that's a 6-year span, probably we'd call it 1904 or 1905. Now, one thing happened. The Richards owned their own home. Don't know when they bought it. Don't know when they bought it, but the home was on Corona Street, which was just south. Corona Street ran north and south, and Colfax, which was right at the corner there, ran east and west. Don't know how they bought it. Leopold, my grandfather, was a tailor, and Charles Grossman, my maternal grandfather, I'm not sure that works too well. He was also a tailor, and I've reiterated before. I have a copy of the first papers my uh, grandfather, my mother's father, took out to become a citizen of the U.S. I was looking for those papers yesterday. I was looking for pictures and papers, and I actually got interrupted, just like we just were right now. I got a phone call from a longtime friend of Lucille's, and when it was over, I forgot all about the pictures and the first papers. I'll address that when this call is over again. Sorry, Brian.
Not a problem. If you're getting quick phone calls, that's from old friends.
Yeah.
That sounds much better.
Okay. I'm kind of wandering off and trying to remember where I was.
Well, let me.
Okay. We're talking how they got to Denver. The short story is probably Charles and my grandmother. Incidentally, her name was Pepe. P-E-P-E. I'm not sure that was a nickname or whatever. They had to go to Denver for their health. Why the Richards followed them there, of course, we'll never know, but we can surmise that they kept in contact after they went to Denver. Obviously, now they lived in, I'm not sure what borough of New York they lived in, but it was most certainly a crowded situation for them. It was really a hassle. From all I've read about the immigrants, most of them ended up either in Brooklyn or on the Manhattan Island, somewhere. But life was not pleasant. For one thing, most of the buildings they had there were 4 to 6 stories, and they didn't have elevators in them. So that means every time you went out, you went down, you had to go back up again. That was certainly not a pleasant situation. So I can understand why they moved to Denver. And they were fortunate enough to be able to buy their own home. I'm not sure when that was. Now, back to my mother. I know that she went to school there. The grammar school was they lived on the northern, check that. They lived on Corona, just south of Colfax. Okay, when you go south down the street, you came to a street called, I think Ogden, I'm not sure. But anyway, that's where the grammar school was. It was to be, later on, I would also go to that grammar school. Let's see. So my mother didn't grow up in New York. She grew up in Denver. And she was later to move in with the Richards in a sense as a housemaid. So that is the story of my mother. And I have a vague memory of Denver because I was 5 years old when we moved in Chicago, and I can relate to being maybe 4.5, because my dad did pretty well as a motorman on the Denver Railway, because we had a car. We had a Model T Ford, but then almost everybody had a Model T, because they were building them by the 100,000s, almost by 1919. In the early part of the 20th century, Ford had built almost 2 million of them. And of course, the population of the country then was maybe 110 million people, something, I don't know. I'm just guessing.
That was a good overview.
Okay, we're talking about my mother, and about it, what a benign woman she was. I never remember an argument between my mother and father. I just have no memories of that. They'll never have a fight or an argument. Also, for whatever reason, there was not much love in our family. I don't ever remember my mother hugging me or showing me love. The same with my father. My father was a hard worker all his life. I don't remember anything about when he was a motorman in the Denver Railroad, but I do remember him as when we were in Chicago, when he was a bread truck driver. I've already told the story of why we left Chicago.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and we came to California, and he went to work. He got his sister and my Aunt Molly got him a job with the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. I remember him. He went to work early, sometimes before we got up, because his route was way out in the sticks, in what was called Bellflower, Compton, North Long Beach. And in those days, we had no freeways, very few major roads, and he always left early because sometimes he would have to go to the office for whatever reason, and then go out and do his route, try and sell insurance and collect dividends. So sometimes he would be gone when we got up, and he would come home late, 6 o'clock at night. And he, every night, and I think I've reiterated this before, and that he would collect premiums, anywhere from a few cents to maybe as much as a quarter. Now, back in the early 30s, a quarter was a lot of money, because that's all some people earned in an hour in those days. But anyway, he would come home with this change. And I remember it was in a white canvas bag, about so high, with a little tie string around it. You would tie it to keep the top open. The first thing he had to do was add up all his collections by going through the book. Each policyholder had a page in the book with all the information about the policyholder. So he had to check off to make sure he had done all his stops were recorded. Then he had to add up all the money he collected according to what his debit book would say. Then he'd have to count the money he collected, and hopefully it was the same as what the book said he collected. So after we got through dinner and he finished his work, he would go on the couch and lay down because he was exhausted. Of course, at the time I didn't realize it. And
so your father was gone during the days, but obviously your mom was there when you woke up, right?
Okay.
So she would make, so tell me a little bit about her,
Okay.
She was making you guys, getting you out the door, I assume, or was she getting you, I mean, maybe I was going to ask if she was getting you lunches, but I've heard stories about the donut shop.
She made lunches for us. She would darn, I remember she would darn socks. She had two little wooden rings, a small one and a big one. And she would put the sock over the ring where the hole was, and she would put an outer ring over the top of them. And the end of the sock looked like a miniature drum with the hole was showed, and she would darn it back and forth, to create something, and anything to keep from buying a new pair of socks. You could buy a pair of socks at the time probably for 15 or 19 cents a pair. She did all the housekeeping. She washed the floors, and at the time there were no such thing as a refrigerator. We had what was called an ice box, and a man usually came in once a day with a 20 or a 30 or a 40-pound block of ice that he would put in the ice box, and it kept things reasonably cold, but the ice would melt, and you had a big pot underneath the ice box. Once a day, you had to take that thing out, hold it over the sink, and dump it. I remember my mother doing that until I got big enough to do it. On weekends, I do remember we always did a lot of things. On weekends, we would go to a ball game at Wrigley Field. My dad was a big boxing fan, a big fight fan. They would go down to, they had once a week, they had boxing matches that was called the Olympic boxing stadium that was up north around Western and First Street, somewhere around in there. I don't remember, but they would take Shirley and myself to a boxing match. I never much cared for them, but that's the way it was. Then we had a friend I've also mentioned in the previous called the Chinns. That was spelled CHINN. The double N came from the fact that a lot of the Asian people that lived in LA at that time, especially the Chinese, they also had a surname of Chinn. They spelled it CHIN with one N, but they spelled theirs with two N. I suppose that was supposed to send a message that he wasn't Asian. It got to and they had a son whose name was Milton. And for whatever reason, I really never cared for him. He just rubbed the hair on the back of my neck the the wrong way. I don't know why to this day, but I just never cared for him. But sometimes during the week, around weekends, my parents and the Chinns would go out, and they would leave Milton with us. And so on evenings, when the doorbell rang, I knew it was probably the Chinns. My folks were going out with them, and I would have to endure an evening with Milton.
What type of places do you think they went, your parents? What type of events were they going to at this time, do you think? Or do you even remember?
Yeah, we stopped going to the fights with them, so
like with the Chinns, like where would they go? Is it just out to restaurants? Were they going to movies? Were they going to shows? What type of stuff?
They never. I don't ever remember them telling us what they were going to do.
That's fine. I was just curious.
Yeah, they would go out maybe to a show or a nightclub. I don't know. To this day, I don't know what they did, but the Chinns and my mother and father, they apparently enjoyed each other's company. And as I've reiterated before, they even went together into business. Now, Paul, let me inject something in here about Paul Chinn. Milton's father was named Paul. His mother was named Lillian Chinn. Now, this was during the Deep Depression from the very early 30s until maybe until Roosevelt's second presidency. There was deep depression in the country. In the West, and specifically in Los Angeles, the Depression didn't hit as bad, because I remember people working, people going shopping, people doing this. I can't address what happened in the rest of the country other than what I've seen on movies or stories, or what I witnessed myself. But in LA, we did not have the deep job losses that they had in the rest of the country. Now Paul, for whatever reason, he was a short, stocky guy, even shorter than my dad. My dad might have been an inch or an inch and a half taller than me. And this explains why we went to boxing matches. Paul was a boxer, and probably not a very good one, because I don't know what his story is about becoming a boxer, but men were doing almost anything to make a living in those days. Okay, so he was a boxer. In 1935, approximately 1935, my dad and Paul went into business together. And what the business was, they bought a truck and trailer, and they were going to be over the road driving for hauling freight. They worked for a company that was called the Arizona Pacific Freight Company. Google I've never done this. Google Arizona Pacific Freight Company. See if you come up with anything.
Okay.
Arizona Pacific Freight.
Nothing really.
Nothing, huh?
No. Pacific Freight Brokers is the closest
Okay.
LLC. So I don't know if it still exists.
Okay. We must remember this was 85 years ago.
Yeah, that's a long time ago.
80 to 85 years ago. Okay. Now,
And we did just to we did get into some of this stuff before, and I just want to make sure that I want to kind of steer this.
okay, we kind of got away from my mother. Okay.
Here, let me kind of I have some questions I want to ask you, or I want to if you don't mind, because I do want to learn more about your mom, and when we've and her she lived a long time, so I want to understand. I want to understand what her life was like. So your childhood, she obviously she didn't work, did she? I'm assuming it was only your father.
No, not before he died. No,
So that's what I want to come up to that point.
How did she live?
We're basically like, how did she? Because your father passed away in the early 40s.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious about how that impacted her and how her life changed. Because I assume I'm making assumptions here, but I'm assuming that made a big change in her life because your father was the breadwinner, or he brought in the money. And so if you could tell me about how that period of time.
Okay. Well, let me see. Now, my sister did everything as far as, well, whatever happened, my sister was very closed-mouthed about it. I never had the gumption to ask her questions about what's happened, what's going on, and all that. So part of this I learned from my nephew, Mike, that would be Shirley's youngest son. That's when I found out that my mother had a pension. It was $25 or $30 a month. At the time, I never knew why my mother got the pension. But I was maybe 20 years ago, something came up, I don't remember. Why was my mother getting a pension from the government? And I was to later find out that my father had a pulmonary problem when he was in the Navy. I think I've gone over this. He was in the Balboa Hospital, maybe for 6 weeks or so, and then he got a medical discharge. Well, he's getting a pension, and he got a medical discharge. 2 and 2 is 4. So my mother's pension came from the government because he contacted, it was supposed to have been pneumonia then, but you wouldn't have gotten a pension from pneumonia then, but you did get a pension from the Spanish flu. And that's the disease my father had. All the evidence points to it. So my mother had a $30, either $25, $30, or $35. I don't remember what it was. Actually, it's a pension my father got. My mother didn't start getting it. My father got it upon when he got out. I don't know if he started getting it when he got out of the Navy, or after he got out of the Army when he was drafted. So I don't know when the pension started, but I know my mother was getting it after my father died. So that was part of her income. I was in the Navy then, so I really couldn't contribute. Now, I did very well for myself in the Navy. I don't know how to otherwise label that. Recruits, either Navy or Army, they were getting $50 a month. That's what a recruit got. When they left basic training and they became privates or low-class seamen, they got $50 a month. Somehow or other, I don't know why I was chosen, but after I got out of boot camp, instead of going out to the fleet, they sent me to diesel school, and I came out of diesel school roughly 7 months after I went in the Navy as a second class petty officer. That would be the same pay grade as a staff sergeant in the Army. So I was getting $96 a month plus room, board, meals, and everything. And I sent most of that back to my mother, figuring she could use it because my only expense were drugstore items, shaving cream, toothpaste, or whatever we needed. All my food, clothing, and other stuff was supplied by the government. After I got discharged, I had $2,600 because when I was overseas, when you go overseas, you get a 15% premium. So I was making $114 a month and sending most of that home. Now, I thought my mother would use it because there was an allotment, and she didn't touch a penny of it. So I came out of the service somewhat of a rich man.
So what did she do for money? Was she able to live off her pension? Did she end up getting a job going forward?
Now we have to talk about another person.
Okay.
And her name was Beulah. Do you remember her?
No.
You don't remember Beulah at all?
I don't think so.
Okay, well, you're the, well, I don't know what to, okay, let's talk about Beulah. Because Beulah was my mother's best friend.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, Beulah was the adopted daughter of a cousin of my mother. Their name was Grossman. So obviously they were a child of one of the Grossman children, a cousin, probably more likely a cousin of my mother's. And Cy, his name was Cy, and let's see. Okay, there was Lou Grossman and Alice Grossman, and they had a son named Milton Grossman. Milt was another one that I didn't like very much for whatever reason, but he was a good kid. But I don't know, maybe because he was chubby. I was like a rail. I was like a rail. I in elementary school, I weighed less than 100 pounds. I was really a string bean. Anyway, and Alice had I guess, an adopted daughter whose name was Beulah. And Beulah was married to a guy's last name was Mitchell. Let's see, what was his first name? I can't remember. Now, he was sort of an electronic genius, because in the early 30s, out of parts that he scrounged up, he was an amateur radio enthusiast. And they occupied one of the other courts that we had on 62nd Street when we lived in the court. Oh, his name was Julius Mitchell. And in one of the garages there, he would do his amateur radio broadcasting. Well, he didn't use a microphone. They used the Morse code. So I remember being in the garage with him, and he would da 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 da. And of course, that meant nothing to me, but he could read it. Now, they had a son. I don't even remember what his name was. And Beulah and Julius did a terrible job raising him, because as a teenager, he got into all kinds of trouble. He got in problem with the law. And it's just that Beulah and Julius were terrible parents. And even as a youngster, I can see that, because he would come home from school and neither Beulah or Julius would be home, or Julius was in the garage doing his radio thing, and a terrible thing. And anyway, Julius was you might call him an electronic genius at the time. Sid Grossman, you know who Sid Grossman is, don't you?
No.
Okay. The Grossman Chinese Theater.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Well, Sid Grossman was the guy that put all this together. And in the late 30s, incidentally, Beulah and Julius eventually separated and divorced. I'm not even going to get into that. But anyway, Sid Grossman had an idea about going in restaurants where you could put a nickel in a machine, and the machine would select a record, the big stack of records, maybe 20 or 24 stack of records. This should mean we could pick out a record, pull it out, put it on that turntable, and play your song.
Jukebox.
Okay. Well, Julius put all that together. All the electronics for that, Julius put together. Then in later years, it became electronic where the music was played in a remote station. You could still put it in a cafe at a booth. They would have these machines on the wall now, instead of having this big player occupy floor space. It occupied a little wall space in the booth. So while you're sitting there, you can put your nickel in there, select your song, and it would play for you. Julius, he put all that together, was the mastermind. I never knew what happened to him. You might try Googling Julius Mitchell.
Okay. I am trying to see if he, because you're saying he was.
Okay. Okay. One more thing. Julius had a sister, and the sister was married to one of the musicians in a famous band. I can't think of the name of the band. Maybe it'll come to me. Well, at the time, it's a well-known band. I think he was his drummer, but the drummer also occupied a bit of a comedic position where he was the foil for the band leader. I can't think of his name. If you understand what a foil is.
Yeah, I do.
Okay. So my mother and Beulah were friends before, but now they were really fast friends. And that friendship went on for the rest of their lives. Well, I'm kind of like it. Ask me a few more questions.
Okay, because I'd like to get. Okay, so
about what my mother did. Okay, let's get back to that. Okay.
Yeah.
So I was gone. I reiterated. My mother, she saved all my money, and I was surprised. She had gotten a job in the lobby of a downtown building. I don't remember the name of it or where it was, but in the buildings, and most buildings at the time, at the entrance, they would have these little cigarette and cigar. They have a big counter. They got cigarettes, cigars, candy, and a lot of associated stuff for people needed a pen or a pencil, upstairs, a paper, everything. Somehow my mother got a job running one of those stations, and she worked at more than one of these things, and she made a decent living for herself at this time, because after what happened, I lived with my mother on 8th Avenue. When did Shirley and Alan bought a house in Venice, that maybe 1947 or 48. I don't remember. When we gave up the apartment on 8th Avenue in Levert Park, my mother found a place to live. Apartments were relatively cheap then. But financially, my mother got along fine. I think I told the story about the time after she passed away, where we were collecting her belongings and getting rid of them, and told the story about the books. You remember that?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
You might have, and I might have forgotten.
Yeah, okay, well, just go remind me where we were cleaning out her possessions. I think we got rid of most of them. One of the last things we had to do was get rid of her books. She had a lot of books because she had a lot of time to read, to spend. And we had a few boxes there. We put these books in the box. There were maybe 6 books in the box. We might have 5 or 6 boxes. There were 20, 30 books. And a bill fell out. Well, either me or my sister picked up a book and we're going to put it in the box, and the bill fell out. And we looked at each other and we both thought the same thing. Oh God, what's the rest of the books? So we had to dump all the books out, and we had to go, some books have 300 pages in them. And so we had to go through all of these books there. We actually found more than $4,500 in $20 bills in the books. Why that happened? It was easier. We concluded it was easier for my mother to put money in a book to save rather than go to take the money to the bank. And she obviously forgot about the money in the books because she never said anything to us. And she got along without that money, don't know for how long to this day. And
that's funny. It would have been, and if you had it,
yeah,
I can only imagine if you had donated that.
Beulah remained
okay, go ahead.
Remained a friend until she passed away. I'm not sure whether she passed away before my mother or probably after my mother, because she was only 11 years older than I was. Let's see, she was born in 1912. Okay. Anyway, I think she passed away before my mom did. I'm not sure. But she was the closest friend my mother had.
I know we're getting long on time, but I want to ask a few more questions. I know you're getting tired. I know, because I talked to you a few days ago, and I didn't know this before, that your mom got remarried, correct?
Oh, yeah. Okay. In 1951 or 1952, here's what happened. My mother loved Las Vegas. And she just mentioned Las Vegas, and she was ready to go.
Did she like to gamble?
My mother had a few friends. She had a few friends. I can't remember who they are, but they used to go to Las Vegas. Now, in Las Vegas, there was this character around there, and I can't think of his name. What was it? He was called the Singing Newsboy. The Singing Newsboy. And what he would do, he would go in for whatever connections he had, all the casinos in there would allow him to come in, and he would sell a newspaper and he would sing. Now, he also thought he was another Al Jolson, because when you heard him sing, he tried to impersonate Al Jolson. And apparently the people loved him. And what would happen, he would sell newspapers, instead of selling a paper for 3 cents or a nickel, or whatever a newspaper sold for then, he'd get a $1 bill. Maybe he'd get a few large coins, 50 cents. There was a time I've seen him get a $20 bill from some of the really well-padded people there. Well, anyway, he apparently took a liking to my mother and wooed her so much that they got married. What was his name? the singing newsboy in Las Vegas in 1950. Google that and see if you can find anything. The singing newsboy, Las Vegas, 1950.
Okay. Nothing jumps out right now, but I could take a deeper dive at some point. Yeah, nothing that jumps out.
Okay. Anyway, my mother married him, and they lived in Las Vegas. Eventually, his true colors came out because there were a lot of incidents that happened. One of them was they went to Texas for whatever reason, and they were coming back there. They got in an automobile accident somewhere in the highway, either in Texas or New Mexico. And shortly after that, my mother left him and divorced him. And one of the decrees in the divorce was she resumed her married name of Richards.
So were they married very long? Was it?
Yeah. So
was it just a year or a few years?
The first decade of the 1950s, she was married, and I still can't think of his name. If it comes to me, I'll add it in a future broadcast. But she left him. There was virtually no married property between them. If there was, it wasn't very much. And that's when my mother really was on her own. Any more questions?
So after that, so she was married a little while then, for
maybe
a few years,
3 years, 4 years. I don't remember the date.
And then she came back to I assume she came back to LA.
She came back to LA, yeah, and she rented a small apartment. She had several locations. I don't remember where they were, but she lived by herself. She got by herself, and she had a productive life. And she retired. She also received a settlement on the accident that injured my father, and but he succumbed to those injuries. And she had my sister Shirley, for whatever reason, was tight-mouthed about it, because there was a trial that went on that I didn't even know was happening, and the accident, apparently the police report, my father was not at fault of the accident. I think what had happened is he had a problem with the truck and was pulled over to the side, and somebody hit him while he was parked. To this day, I'm not sure what happened. Again, Shirley was tight-mouthed. She knew everything, never passed it on to me. Anyway, she got a court ordered settlement, and sometime in the mid-50s, early to mid-50s, and I think the settlement was $5,000. That it might have been a fair sum then, but it probably should have been maybe 5 to 10 times that amount. But that's mostly what my mother lived on after that. In the early 50s, even though the war brought a period of what they call it, prices going up.
Inflation?
Inflation brought a period of inflation. It was still living was still relatively cheap, where you can rent a small apartment for $30 a month. Yeah, my mother did okay, and she remained friends with Beulah till one of them. I'm not sure. Yeah.
When did your mother pass away?
Well, that was in 1987. Incidentally, there's to bring a little bit of humor in this. A week before she passed away, this was sometime in October of 1987. One time during the night, a earthquake hit LA. The Southern California area, and it was sharp enough to wake us up, and it woke up both Lucille and myself. And when it was over, we went back to bed. And
is the Whittier
we went
Whittier
back
earthquake?
Huh?
Is the Whittier earthquake?
Huh?
October 1st, 1987, the Whittier earthquake.
Okay, yeah.
Whittier one.
October 31st?
October 1st.
October 1st. Okay.
It happened at 7:42 a.m. 5.9.
4:42 a.m. Yeah.
7:42. 7:42.
7:42. Okay, then no, this was okay. This must have been an aftershock of that earthquake. Then this was an aftershock, because this was between maybe between 3 and 4 o'clock, sometime between midnight and 4 o'clock, say. We had this light earthquake shock that woke us up, and we went back to sleep. And maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes after we went to sleep, the phone rings. So I get up to answer the phone, and it's Michael. And he says, always called me Unc, U-N-K, Unc. He says, Unc, there's a problem with Grandma. I forget what the exact conversation was like, but it went something like this. Grandma says that there's a Schwarze in her bed. Now that's the Jewish term for African Americans. And Michael told me, I tried to tell her, there's nobody in your bed. You were disturbed by an earthquake. And the two of them had an argument. My mother insisting that something broke up her apartment, and there was a black man laying in her bed. So he couldn't convince her. So when their conversation ended, he called me, and that's when he said, "Unc, and after the earthquake, Grandma thinks that there's somebody in their bed." He says, "I know there's not, but would you go over there and see what's happening?" So, okay, so at 4:30 in the morning, I got dressed and I drove over there. Now, my mother had this little apartment, and both Shirley and I had a key to the apartment because you needed a key to operate the elevator. The elevator was not inside the building. The elevator was outside. So to keep strangers out of the building, residents of the building had the key, and Shirley and I had both one. So I put the key in there, went up to the apartment, and I let myself in. My mother was sitting with her back to the door in the rocking chair. She had her arms folded, rocking back and forth. And she turned around and looked at me. She had a scowl on her face. And then she took her thumb over her shoulder. She's pointing towards the bedroom like that, pissed off as hell that we didn't believe her. And I walk in the bedroom, and sure enough, there's an African-American laying in the bed. And to say that I was surprised would be very mild. So I walked back in there. I said, "How did he get in?" And she pointed back towards the bedroom again. She didn't, I don't think she said anything. She might have said the window. So I walked back in the bedroom and looked to my right, and at the window was open and the screen was gone. Okay. So that's what happened. So right away, I picked up her phone and called the police. Gesundheit. In due course, the police came, and of course they made an arrest and all that. There was this was a house break, and there are a lot of happenings after that that are really not germane to this right now. But what had happened is that she lived in this senior apartment complex, and which they also had a room where you could have parties. There were tables, you play cards there, and whatever they had for senior buildings in there was off to one side of the building. It was only a single-story building, though, and the building my mother was in was a two-story building, maybe 3 stories. My mother's bedroom window overlooked the roof of that special room, the senior room there. And on one of the walls of that building that faced Sherman Way, there had a big bank of gas meters. Now there might have been 20 or 24 apartments in that building. I'm not sure how many. And on the south wall of the building there was a meter, a gas meter for each apartment. Only instead of being along the side, they were maybe 4 wide and 6 high. And each meter was supplied with an inlet from the supply side that supplied the gas to the meter, and the other side was an exit side where each pipe went to its own apartment. Well, what this guy did is, he for one thing, he was intoxicated. And according to him, he thought that's where he lived, because apparently he lived in an apartment that had a similar setup for all the gas meters. apparently it was very common, although most of those would have probably appear in the back of a building, not on the front. But in this case, for whatever reason, they were on the front. So this guy just climbed up the inlet or outlet pipes and was able to get on the roof of this building. And then all he wanted to do was get into his apartment and go to sleep. Well, he came to my mother's window. The window was open. That's how she slept, always with an open window. Oh, and he just tore the screen off and walked in and got in bed with my mother. And of course, my mother woke her up, and she went into a dizzy, went into the other room, and while either she called Mike or Mike might have called her because of the earthquake to see if she was okay. I'm not sure what happened. Maybe Mike, when Mike hears this, he'll tell us whether he called his grandma to see if she was okay after the earthquake, or she called him. Not important, but it's how it happened. Anyway, that's how he got in. So that's the that's the story. Now, it might have affected my mother to the degree that in the following week, she declined rapidly. She was 87 years old. She declined rapidly, and she had trouble breathing. And the following Thursday, I believe it was a Thursday, we had to take her into the hospital. Took her to Northridge Hospital, and I don't remember specifically what date she died in. Probably was on the following Friday is the day she died. That pretty well ended that, because the following week I got a phone call from the Los Angeles Police Department, and apparently a charge was filed against him. That is the African American. I don't know what the charges were. Probably housebreaking, and wanted to know if my mother could testify at a trial. And I had that information that my mother had passed hadn't been passed down to them yet. And I told them what had happened. And their case involved her directly. Mm-hmm. And she wasn't available to testify. And I don't know, I found him inside the house. I don't know why they didn't ask me to testify. I certainly could have. But anyway, that ended that. And it's 10:30, I think.
Yep. We'll call it a day.
We'll call it a day.